Oh, we just try to use a comma.
Yeah, yeah. So it's kind of everybody's first Japanese sutra chant that they memorize.
One day, okay.
And so if you could just and you could take this, and just familiarize yourself with how it starts and how it ends, so that then you can count. And it starts off.
Yeah, he does. It
starts off kanze nam, very slowly. Read my email.
Okay.
It starts off very slowly.
Okay. I can do slow. I have a harder time with fast.
and fast is just bouncing. At the end of tonight's meeting,
It'll just play a little bit. Okay.
And you're going to be around tomorrow morning?
Yes.
Because maybe you can point out to me where that incenser is, that portable incenser.
Yeah.
And also I'm doing the ceremony, and also the statement.
Oh, yeah. Remind me.
Yeah, so I'll catch you tomorrow.
Okay.
Okay. Have a great. Now, David.
Yes, sir.
All of a sudden got very serious.
Lisa and I are going to go to a music event tonight. So
That's
you
weren't in the office, were you?
No.
The lights on.
I'll see who's in the audience. Would you like to learn over time the full moon ceremony that we do once a month here?
Sure.
And it would require coming
every full moon.
Yeah.
Not every.
But I'm trying to
increase the number of people.
At least and run it by people with rockets music.
Yeah, that seems like something I should do.
So like over the next few months. So it's not like so we'll email each other.
Okay.
And kind of set up, like maybe the next month here, we could.
It's what, 2 weeks away.
We could, or the next. No, I mean maybe the next time you're here for this event.
Okay.
We could come a little earlier. Still, we could do like a half-hour run through, and that could be
initiation. Yeah. Okay. I can do that.
Okay. You've got a singing background. You've sung in church choirs.
No.
But he's got a good voice.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, we did one because
John, we got John. I'm just excited we got somebody. I did invite Sally.
Oh, you got it.
Sally Marigold or
Margot.
Yeah, I invited her. John, there he is. I see you now.
Chanting for Sally tomorrow.
Yes, yeah, she's trying to talk to me.
No offense, John, but you want to say anything, or because I'm gonna mute you? You got some music going on in the background.
He says that's his mom who likes.
So okay, you're muted. You're muted now. Go ahead and feel free to jump in whenever you feel the need.
Because you're muted.
I have you all the way up, volume wise. So just jump in, unmute yourself.
Okay.
So he's muted himself. So.
Oh, we have a small group.
Yeah.
But a big group.
Nettie said she was going to be convinced to go ahead and start with our.
Oh, she's coming. Okay.
Yeah.
I need some glue.
I know.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah, for the discussion.
Well,
Thank you.
yeah, sure. Thank you for invoking the conversation last week.
Which one did you have in mind?
There were 2 meetings, and
okay. Good.
I wanted to focus on the one by Anita Barrows, but so I felt it would be good to inform a conversation with some background. Um, this one, Anita Barrows, I can tell is obviously, I still feel like that it's very relevant. And I also think that what she's talking about with regard to anger could be applied to anybody really. It doesn't, it's not necessarily just about women. That, you know, at any point in your life, if you felt some kind of injustice, that anger has arisen in your life, there's, you know, this question about how you deal with it in your practice. And I think what she's saying is, you know, the danger is that if we try to whitewash anger too quickly, I think she says if we jump right into loving kindness without first examining that anger, then we miss out on an opportunity to correct injustice. And I think we also miss out on an opportunity to gain wisdom. I think that, you know, she calls it holy anger is really, it could be a gate to wisdom, which, you know, and I think that she's very careful to distinguish between anger and violence. We often associate the two. Hi. We're just getting started, so.
Apologies for being late.
No worries. So I'd like to focus more on Anita's work, but as I said, I found sometimes I wonder if maybe I'm drawing parallels that weren't necessarily there or aren't too obvious, but I did feel like there was some from the Platform Sutra, the readings we did months ago now, that there were definitely some points that spoke to what she's talking about in this short little essay of hers. So I figured maybe as we start a conversation about the essay, we could go back to the Platform Sutra as needed. But that really, you know, I think this is from a book called Women on the Edge, and it's actually a bunch of different feminist writers. Some are teachers, some are students, some are poets. They're kind of across the gamut, different women. But there's in it, it's a lot of conversation about how Buddhism can be abused or misused unintentionally to continue this sort of oppressive nature that women experience in our everyday life. And this essay of the ones that I read, I haven't read them all, I thought was probably the most even keeled of all of them. It didn't lean too much towards kind of radicalism, and it also wasn't so soft that it didn't say anything. Mm-hmm. So it's one of the reasons why I picked it. But anyhow, I don't know if everybody got an opportunity to read it. I thought maybe we could just start the conversation by maybe thinking about how anger has arisen for us in the last month or week, and how you might have felt the desire to oppress or not, and where that, if that led to any sort of own personal discoveries. I'll stop talking now.
I just wanted to check in. Did anyone else get the message from Sally that she'd like to join in on Hangouts?
I invited her, but I think she had a last minute thing that came up. But she's invited if she is available. Like I did think about something I've heard before, which is spiritual sidestepping. I don't know if you guys have ever heard that term. Bypassing. That's the word, where you feel discomfort in some way, but you kind of justify it by saying, you know, either that's God's plan, or like saying like you're saying that that's the self, in our tradition, that's the self that's coming up and wanting me to feel resistance against it. But really you have been, it's like somebody is, like the situation is, you're not dealing with the situation at hand. So that definitely was something that I thought of, and that she mentions as well, which is not taking the time to explore the anger or figure out why what's happening to you is going on, or what the injustice is, and automatically going towards I won't say the easy answer, but the sweeping it under the rug, I think, is what I kind of get. And I'll get into something a little later. Let somebody else talk. I do have something else to say, but it'll come up later.
I think one of my favorite lines in the Platform Sutra we picked out for tonight, which was in the second paragraph of section 14, where it says, deluded people who cling to the external attributes of the Dharma get hold of one practice samadhi and just say that sitting motionless, eliminating delusions, and not thinking thoughts are one practice samadhi. But if that were true, a Dharma like that would be the same as lifelessness and would constitute an obstruction of the way instead. The way has to flow freely. Why block it up? So the connection that I see there is this idea of that Dharma is not lifelessness, and that anger is a form of life. And she uses the analogy of a storm coming through and crashing waves. And I think that when we attempt to ignore those crashing waves or that storm, we're pretending that stillness is lifelessness, when in fact we have to let the wave flow freely. So that's sort of the parallel I drew to that. One or two liners there.
I've just been reading from Deepak Chopra, who's talking tomorrow night, and I won't be here for that because we're ushering at the Civic Auditorium. In his book, I can't remember exactly. Anyway, he talks about not getting caught in the anger, but going back to the hurt that caused the anger in the first place. And that we all have hurt, and it's ongoing back and forth kind of thing. It's part of life. And anger in regards to the hurt is extra. Now we may feel it, but the question is to be able to see it, not get caught up in it, still feel it, and let it go back to the hurt that caused it in the first place, and be without instead, which is really just part of living, and not get caught up. And I find myself doing something like that. Part of me likes to watch when I'm home the news with Joyce, but there's so much happening that I usually don't make it through all the way to the end where I need a timeout. And just try to understand where all these folks are coming in, how much stress they're all under, we're all under, but that's just one layer. And what really helps offset that is then to take a tree break and go out and sit under a tree or out in nature someplace. I'm just even looking out the window at the trees, and really, they are so grounded and firm. They don't move. They probably get hurt, but they don't, anyway, they don't show it. But that helps ground me. Yeah, so just taking a nature break and then taking a break from whatever is, but not trying to push it away, but just be with it in a quiet moment. Seems to help.
I think that's true that you can trace anger back to hurt or pain, which is a more vulnerable feeling than anger, which is often why we naturally go to anger, because it makes us feel stronger.
Yeah, and righteous.
But I think also there's this distinction that I think is really good to make in this discussion about maybe we could say like justified anger.
Yeah,
it's hard to say exactly what, because maybe anytime we're feeling any anger, we probably do feel it's justified, right? Mm-hmm. But then I don't know, when you said anger, recently, I think what times that I've been angry recently, when I reflect back on it, it's almost never justified, really. It's kind of just a selfish thing. I can see I was holding on to something. But then we have this kind of anger that's like about an injustice, and it's maybe like by not responding, it perpetuates the injustice. I think it's like a particular kind of anger.
Yeah, I think, and the reason I brought this article to our attention is because of the conversation last month about feminism and being women and experiencing oppression. You know, I don't want to generalize either and say that anger is the first place that a woman goes to when you experience oppression. It can be very subtle. I just walked away from a conversation from somebody, it was off work hours, but somebody who's technically an HR person telling me I needed to dress sexier. So, you know, and then from another woman, you know, and so, you know, I didn't have any sort of reaction other than to laugh at the ridiculousness of that proposition, because it's just not who I am. But, you know, in hindsight, I was like walking up the hill thinking, that's just, I mean, I am angry about that, because here is this other woman who feels that she's this beautiful woman and she feels like she has to do these things to herself to make her more attractive. And it's sad. What it does come back to is a sense of pain and kind of this, you know, this oppression that women have. We not only experience from the outside in, but that also other women perpetuate for other women. So it can be hard to distinguish, I think, you know, in the moment, like, well, am I getting angry because she made me feel inadequate, or am I getting angry because that's not how we should treat each other as women? That's not the kind of expectation we should have of each other.
Well, I've had some thoughts along those lines, and that what she said to you makes me angry too, because the idea that women need to dress sexier is something that a lot of men would agree with to satisfy their own liking to look at sexy women. But that's an object-oriented thing. It's not seeing the person. And so creating this, it's sad men and women, some women are working together, not conspiratorially, mostly because of their and our cultural background that just passes along what we absorbed, and it just continues in society. On and on, it perpetuates itself. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I didn't know what really I wanted to say, but that prompted that. But I've been struggling with the meaning of turning the other cheek for quite some time. And I see that as a very profound way of empathizing with the other person's position in some situation, in a way that shows complete presence, that possibly then will allow communication, two-way communication to happen, to diffuse the whole thing in the first place, instead of throwing fuel on the fire by getting angry if the other person's angry at you. And I mean, that can be a powerful thing, but if the other person doesn't see you while you're seeing him, then you can just be squashed like a bug in a heartbeat. And that's scary. There's a dichotomy there in my understanding of what this might mean, turning the other cheek. And then I was curious because Anita Barrows brought that up in a way that made me kind of wonder what she meant. I don't see page numbers, but okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5th page, 3rd paragraph, talking about the transformation of anger into the energy of love. It would be easy to read this. We are conditioned to read this by thousands of years of culture as a Buddhist variant of, quote, turn the other cheek, unquote. And when I read that, I went, is that good or bad? I mean, I don't know what. See, is it like saying there's something wrong with because we are conditioned to read this by thousands of years of culture as a variant of turn the other cheek. So is that bad
Sounds like it's maybe a critique.
or good?
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like critique, but then last month I was saying
Yeah,
that these sayings are the equivalent of turn the
yeah,
other
the
cheek,
8
and I'm
verses,
thinking,
right?
well, if there's something wrong with that, and there's something wrong with this, so I don't know, just throwing that out there.
Well, I think what Kokyo is saying a minute ago is sort of, there is a turning the other cheek that happens in maybe a good way when we're realizing that the anger we have is about self-righteousness or ego or a dichotomy, an artificial dichotomy that we create between me and other. And then there's that use of turning the cheek when we're in a situation where, I'm being told I need to dress a different way. That's the bad version of turning the other cheek. And, I kind of struggle a little bit with this idea of good and bad. And I was rereading this section of the Platform Sutra I pulled out where he's talking about the transformation body and that a good thought can transform 1,000 years of bad thoughts and vice versa. And this distinction between good and bad. And it's just so hard, I think, to know with anger when it's a good anger and when it's a bad anger. And, maybe that idea of taking a moment to sit in stillness and really examine it outside of the situation is helpful for us to understand a little more if it's a good anger or a bad anger. And then sometimes it's really hard to know. It's very gray, particularly if the anger is coming, I think, from somebody who you're closer with, a loved one, and it's a more painful one. And so it's, I don't know that there is a good or a bad turning the cheek. I think that there's both.
Right. The discrimination of which is which isn't something that can come instantaneously at the moment, I don't think. It's always in retrospect, and if that can be done prior to throwing fuel on the fire, it's better. So that would mean like kind of metaphorically biting your tongue.
Yes.
As opposed to actually turning the other cheek, because it's going to be good or bad. Maybe I'll just back off.
Yeah.
I want to apologise that I didn't do the reading. I just couldn't imagine that tonight was Jaws in the World. It felt like it was just a week ago. So I was thinking it was like after the climate change the following Thursday. And then when I saw you two out there, I thought, hold on a second. I apologise. I wanted to, but my plan was.
Well, thanks for coming.
Yeah.
Small group.
But my thoughts about anger a little bit is what I notice in myself is I don't tend to feel internally angry very much, but I do get firm. Like I can say, that's not okay. So it doesn't happen very often, but I can have that kind of energy where I can be firm, but I feel like it's more kind of, I'm rising up. I think there's something not right. And I'm saying so. It's more like that. It doesn't, I'm not having so much like, this isn't, it's not like that. So that kind of feels nice. So I think that distinction about that came up when we talked about anger some months ago, action on the outward action, like Black Lives Matter type of like, this is not okay. But inside there's no malice, there's no hatred, there's no negative feeling. And the other thought I had about turning the other cheek is if I'm in the kind of oppressed position, then turning in the other cheek might not be skillful because that silence can kind of reinforce the oppression, which isn't good for others who might also get oppressed. But if I'm in the slightly more dominant position, then turning the other cheek, I think often is appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing I can think of recently that's slightly related to this, it's kind of comical. I walked down there and a man called out, "I like your breasts." I'm nearly 60 years old. I dress in the most boring. I mean, it's like,
Which breast did you have in mind?
and I just sort of like, oh, wow.
What do you say?
I just didn't have any angry feelings. So I thought, for a man to say that to me at this point, with me looking like this, he must be in a very strange stage. And I just felt compassion for him. I thought, he probably needs to be hugged. But I wasn't going to quite do that.
You're not going to offer that up, no.
But it felt like to be angry to him, because I felt in that position, I actually felt in a more powerful position to him.
Mm-hmm.
Just because of the fact that he said it to me, and me looking the way I do, it just felt very, but it felt a bit crazy. So I didn't feel like didn't have any angry feelings towards him. But maybe in a different situation, I would have, but more from that sense of that's not an all right way to behave.
Yeah, I mean, similar how I felt when I was just told I needed to dress sexier. It wasn't, I mean, I thought it was funny, and I didn't feel angry at this person so much as I felt pain for the fact that she feels that that's how we have to be as women. And then the anger is about the sense of injustice that she feels that way, that she's been so conditioned to that she thinks that women have to present themselves with makeup on and hair curled and so on and so on. But I really like your analogy of the dominant versus the one who has been oppressed, and that's where that distinction of turning the other cheek.
Yeah, and the other thought I had about that is I think as our practice deepens, we don't tend to feel so much in inferior positions because we don't have such a strong sense of ego in the first place. So we actually can feel like we can rise up more into a meta picture of things, and probably then turning the other cheek is actually a little easier because we're not feeling as oppressed. So we're just not so identified personally, and we can see, oh my gosh, this person's grasping at straws right now, or whatever they're doing.
Yeah.
So maybe it does get easier to actually do that.
Yeah.
So something along these lines, not feminism related, but woman related, but more just as a person of Mexican descent. I was working with another engineer who's also family's also from Mexico, and I always was surprised how he would see things, kind of like you're saying. He would see certain events that happened and turn them into him being oppressed because he's Hispanic. But I never felt that way. I never saw it through that lens. And it's interesting that you say that the position of dominance. We were in the same exact position as far as our kind of how we were brought up and where we ended up in our jobs. We're both engineers. We both went to college, and we're at equals in our professional lives. So he was constantly saying, "Oh no, David, you're oppressed." And I was like, what do you mean? I don't see it. I mean, if I really look hard, I have to personally look really hard, and maybe I am, but I don't see it that way. I don't see that I'm as oppressed as he does, as him. That's in his experience. So, kind of like you walking down the street, you're kind of like, what do you mean? What's going on? But I noticed that a lot of other people of Hispanic descent, they kind of group together and kind of perpetuate this idea that everything that happens is somehow tied to the color of their skin. And I've just never felt that way growing up. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist,
Yeah.
but I just resonated with what you were saying of how you may not even think anything's going on. And I don't know if there's something wrong with me, that I'm not seeing it, or I just got off easy. But it's kind of interesting.
Well, it's probably, my guess is it's probably that because you're actually a confident person within yourself. And I say that because my son, who's dark skinned, he doesn't say he experiences any racism at all. And he's usually the darkest skinned person around. And I think it's because he's kind of confident. So if it does come toward him, it just doesn't penetrate very far, and he doesn't amplify it in his mind in any way. A little different because he's Indian, which the racism is a little different. It's not as harsh and not as threatening type of a racism. It's more kind of sort of mildly demeaning that you're sort of not either you're into computers or something, or you're going to be a doctor or something, or that you're just shouldn't be athletic. But he just doesn't. It doesn't really register.
I think it helps. I often think it helps being in California and growing up where I grew up, that I feel this way. And I don't know if I'm insulated from it in some ways because of the environment I'm in, but I felt the same way. I feel similar to what you're describing your son as. Not very much.
I think this is a great point. That's like that I wouldn't have thought of until this discussion. That there is this thing about this is part of the mix here about this self-esteem or self-confidence kind of thing, and that maybe something like these 8 verses for training the mind. I think they probably were. Maybe we even talked about it last month. I think those teachings are meant for these monks who are like already kind of cooking along in practice and have a lot of self-confidence and maybe even arrogance, which is kind of like self-confidence gotten too big. Yeah. And then those verses are great for training for that. But with someone who's already feeling oppressed all the time due to actual oppression or just their own karmic disposition, then it wouldn't be so healthy. And then I'm also thinking about could you even take this further, this idea of that both you were mentioning, like when you have that some sense of confidence in yourself, you can almost like, it's a more compassionate response to see the oppressor as like almost like a kind of sadness, where they're kind of disturbed and almost like and I'm sorry that they're perpetuating this in the world, and even like the person's kind of crazy, which you could go that far. Maybe any oppressor is slightly insane, and then I wonder about applying that to something like our president.
Yes, I'm thinking that.
Some people would say he's like mentally ill, it's like, and which could, it could be like, well, I'm so sad that I mean, you could take the kind of insanity thing really far and say that our president is insane and that our country is insane because they elected him. It's almost like sort of like it's less anger and more like compassion. But then maybe the problem with that would be if it undermines, but we have to do something about it.
I think also, one of the things that I was like really woken to with his election was that we live in a country where half the country feels very differently about certain issues that I thought were just like a given, like, I mean, there are some things that have always been controversial in politics, but I think it was really a wake-up call for me to say that there's half, well, maybe not half, or less than half of our population has actually been feeling like silenced in a way. And maybe I don't agree with the majority of the politics of this person, but wow, that half of our country felt like they for once had a voice. And a lot of those people may no longer feel that way because of the backpedaling, but I think it was really in some ways it was very that anger that I felt at that point in time was also very eye-opening, and is a pathway to self-reflection and wisdom. But you're right, we can. I think that can also be oh, that person is crazy. In a case that's more serious than somebody catcalling you, that could be harmful in that you might be too quick to turn the other cheek or too quick to jump into loving kindness when there is a call to action that is there.
I don't remember exactly when it was. There was a Martin Luther King convocation at the Civic Auditorium, and the speaker was Gwendolyn, and she talked about intersectionalism. And she was African American, and basically intersecting race with women's rights, so that all the different folks now that are dealing with the patriarchy or dealing with race questions are coming together as one and sharing how it feels to be oppressed in different ways, and then what we as a group, as a country, can do. And I think in one way that it's very heartening for me to see this coming out of the situation we're in. And it may not have there may not have been intersectionalism without President Trump and all that he's brought to kind of finally bring, because the patriarchy has been, male white patriarchy has been the rule of this country and Europe for centuries. And it's never been really talked about. There's been race stuff, there's been women's rights and stuff like that, but not the overall white patriarchy. It's basically still running the country and much of the world. So to hear that, it was a really empowering talk. It was very helpful. Inspiring.
My thought too is that if we really can come from a compassionate place, then our action will be much more effective.
Yes.
And we think of people who are affected, like Martin Luther King,
Yeah.
Nelson Mandela, and Mother Teresa, and
Gandhi, yes. I think so.
they weren't rageful.
Right.
Yes.
That ragefulness, I think, just dissipates really quickly. It's too
Yes.
dangerous, and
Yeah.
it creates too much
Yes.
havoc, and it generates too much hatred, it creates chaos. I think it's actually that steady, centered, compassionate, and you feel, you're not feeling intimidated too much.
Yeah.
You're feeling you've got that meta view of things.
Empowered.
So I think being compassionate actually is the only way to be truly effective
Yes.
in terms of political activism,
Yeah.
in whatever form.
Yes.
So I think it's good not to have this idea like, well, if you're too compassionate, you won't do anything. I think it actually in the end truly is the reverse. That only if you have that compassion that you can be truly effective as an activist.
I just had this little insight as to differences in the metaphor of turning the other cheek versus for training the mind. And because I've always taken the turning the other cheek to be a metaphor, and wondered about the actual act of doing it, if it would really do anybody any good. Did you say, well, hit me again? But in the verses for training the mind, we're to see the person as our teacher, because there's something to be learned from what's happening in me by what that person just said or did that I felt was unjust. And that's a huge difference. It's not that you're going to actually let somebody violently do damage to you. It's talking about verbal interactions, treat you unjustly, violate you, insult you, and so forth. And so as far as our practice goes, that's really appropriate and simple, and there's no damage done there. But if we see what it's doing to me, that doesn't mean we ignore the damage that the same thing would do to other people. We can have compassion for our new teacher and maybe have some inspiration and insights about how to help absorb that anger in a way that it dissipates. And teaching the Dharma is the best way to actually do that. That's the Bodhisattva way. So, whereas it's a little more cryptic and Christian, right? I mean, there are a lot of things, walk an extra mile if the soldier tells you to, give someone your cape if you ask for your shirt or something like that. It's always do a little more than you're asked for. Parable of the Good Samaritan, which was a race that was wildly discriminated against by the Hebrews, the Jews. And but the Jew did, or the Samaritan actually helped a Jew that was martyred. So all those teachings in Christianity, if you blend them all together, are to show compassion in situations that make you feel uncomfortable and maybe afraid, and to just see the other person as more important, temporarily, say. So anyway, that was just a little thought I had about the difference between the two metaphors.
Along those lines, the Dalai Lama has said, and this quote I really do enjoy, my greatest enemies are my greatest teachers. He was talking about the Chinese and what they did with the Tibetans.
Right.
And he experienced it personally.
Yeah. Well, he was a big proponent of the 8 verses for training the mind, so he took it to heart, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think he just learned from his experience of having to escape Tibet and all that he went through and all that Tibet went through.
That was his greatest practice, yes.
In this discussion, I think the word anger is a key thing. We haven't really defined it exactly. So maybe that's where it's like when we're saying we can have compassion and still be firm and very strong and say no and be willing to act drastically to for justice, for example. But I think that's interesting to explore. What would this what she calls, is it righteous anger?
Holy anger.
Holy anger, and then
Rage versus outrage.
Rage and outrage, yeah. And I think they're such a loaded word.
They are, yeah.
Yeah, they
We're scared of them.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I think that's the point she makes,
Not
is that there's a fear underlying those words. Because we've been conditioned to associate them with violence or negative things.
Yeah, and maybe just like turning the other cheek, I think of as a provocative metaphor, even if it's not meant to be literal. In a way, I think she's being provocative in the article by using those words.
Yeah.
And I wonder what could there be, like as Nettie is saying, where we don't feel this inside, like threatened personal self in the same way, which I think usually goes with rage, but wouldn't have to.
Yeah, so what she says about rage. She says, rage often summons for us the notion of something out of control. But rage can also be the power of a storm, sheer elemental force. Rage in the sense of outcry, rage in the face of the inevitable, suffering, old age, and death. How can we reach acceptance without first going through rage? Rage in the sense of refusal, rage which can be set against the huge, the intransigent, the unassailable, precisely because it is not hampered by the conservative instinct which would enumerate to it all the ways which it is doomed, mistaken, and intemperate. Rage which knows it's doomed and goes on anyway. And then what she says about outrage is that with outrage, anger takes a leap into the arena of injustice. Outrage broadens the base. This is not only painful and humiliating, it's wrong. Outrage leads to resistance. We shall not be moved. Rosa Parks taking her seat at the front of the bus. The tree huggers warding off the loggers. We have learned that the oppressor may be undermined by resistance, not by superior force, but by fortitude, faith, conviction, and defiance of authority. Outrage is the conjunctio of rage and eros, outrage is the conjunction of rage and eros, where what informs rage is love, and the absolute determination that what one loves shall be preserved. So, I mean, I think for her, she's trying to get us away from the word anger, but that to understand that, there is this kind of holiness about it. And that, we've been so conditioned to fear those words of rage, outrage, anger, because we think that they immediately lead to violence or to bad. But, her point is she's I guess she works with abused women, and so her point is oftentimes you first have to go through this gate of being angry to realize that there's been an injustice that has occurred, and that it doesn't mean that that person is going to act out of violence. That you can have this rage or outrage and actually have it be that's something that's an emotion that's informed by love. So anger is such a loaded word, and I think especially as women we're really fearful of that, because it wasn't that long ago where women were expected to always smile and have heels on and wear skirts, and it's been fairly recently that women have been allowed to actually be in the workplace as equal to men. We're still not paid as much, but at the very least, we have laws in place that protect us, and so I think that there's an appropriate place for this, at least the way she defines it, this sense of outrage, which is something that can be informed by compassion or love. That is also still maybe a form of anger, but not the kind of anger that we think of, which is one of violence.
I feel outraged about the school shooting that happened.
Yes.
That just happened, and the inaction of our government every single time that these kind of instances happen. I was just listening to a news report on the way over here, and that I actually brought me to tears driving over here, hearing one of the mothers talk about her 14-year-old daughter, and she was enraged that there's been inaction. She called out President Trump, like in a screaming, like kind of crying voice, do something, stop these guns from being put into people's hands. And that rage I feel that for that injustice it's very difficult to feel the compassionate side of it. Like how do you feel compassionate for the NRA and the politicians who are paid by the NRA to say the complete opposite of what we need, and completely sidestep the issue. So I'm not there yet. I don't know how to get there, and it's definitely something that I feel that type of, I don't know if it's the holy rage or like kind of seeing the injustice there.
Yeah.
But I have a hard time feeling the compassion for the other side, and I don't know how you guys feel, but it happens too often.
Yeah.
Now.
One thing that I have found really helpful in the teachings is the sense that injustice will continue, or suffering, injustice is a form of suffering, will just continue endlessly. And not to be complacent, but by having that expectation, there's a school shooting and there will probably be another one, and then there'll be another one, and there'll be another bad president, and then we'll get rid of food stamps, and that these things will happen. And for me to expect them to happen helps me not get that You know, sometimes anger comes from just the shock of hearing something bad, and the anger comes up. By getting better at sort of expecting injustice, personal injustice, societal injustice, but getting better at expecting it to happen, I get less surprised and you know, get less shocked when something bad happens. It's more like, oh yeah, that's right. Well, it is endless. It's going to be, you know, ongoing. I find that very helpful. It just helps me not get that jolt. That jolt, I think, quickly leads us into feeling angry and adversarial. So I don't know if that would be helpful. It can sound kind of like giving up, but it's not at all a giving up thing. You know, it's not at all. It's more just seeing, the way I think of it is just being able to be actually with reality. The reality is there's just immense amounts of injustice all around the world.
When you say that, I'm reminded of our walking meditation, how we take a half step, you know, not a full step to go forward to like make a lot of change. We're taking these little half steps to get where we're trying to go. I don't know, we're not even trying to get anywhere, right? We're just taking these half steps. And at this point, I'm having a hard time being complacent with those half steps, kind of like you're saying, like expecting these things to happen. It's just it's too frequent, and having children, elementary school kids, you know, and not even that sacred. I mean, you know, there's been elementary school shootings, and it's just sad to see that, you know, the world they're growing up in. So, anyway,
But I think, you know, what you were saying is that it's so there's pain in there, and that you know you were crying on the way over here hearing that story, and that what you're feeling is not, I think, a sense of inappropriate anger. I mean, at least, you know, the way that this article is reading and the way that I identify with this is that there is a place for letting that pain come through, because if you don't let that pain come through, you're too quick to say, oh, well, this is the way the world is, then you risk the chance of, you know, in sort of, I guess, the terms of the oppressed or the oppressor, you risk the chance of trying to purge yourself of something too quickly. So you can actually do yourself more harm than good by not allowing yourself to feel that pain. So I think, I mean, I don't know, I think it's okay to be angry. I think it's okay to feel that pain and want to like slam your fist against a fence or something. It's very specific because I just did that. You know? But that's better than going out and having a drink, you know. And so there's a self-destructive way of dealing with it, and then I think there's a healthy way of dealing with it. And crying and screaming is, I mean, that's healthy. We're human. We're gonna experience pain. So, you know, at the same time, like maybe holding that expectation that I'm going to continue to feel pain and suffering, and that's okay. You know, this will happen again. But that doesn't mean that I can't scream and, you know, hit the fence and do something about it in my own way. And I don't know what that is for you. Sometimes I feel the same. Like I want to be more active. I want to do more. I want to help correct all the injustices that are in the world. But if you try to jump too quickly into things, then, you know, probably not going to be as effective.
You burn out.
Yeah.
Something that helps me, I mean, I feel the pain and desire the action, but again, just mirroring what you guys are saying, not wanting to overdo or underdo, find that right middle way and stepping back. Recently, I've thought quite a bit about how close we came to the day after, you know, and a nuclear holocaust. So many times I was in military intelligence. This happened many, many times. So we were within 30 seconds to a minute of destroying the world. That didn't happen. By comparison, these are huge and they're ongoing issues, but from back then, still going, but we're still here to deal with it. And that helps me, that gratitude that somehow got a hotline in Moscow and in Washington in 1962. And we're still here because of that. And we can still then act to work together to deal with our issues collectively as a world, especially with climate change.
Yeah, it's a really great perspective.
Mhm.
You know, and we often talk about in Buddhism, it's like, you know, there is no life or death, and that, you know, it's I think sometimes, you know, in Zazen you are able to lose that perspective that of me versus them and this
Yeah.
versus that and
Yeah.
time and all
Yeah.
of that can disappear.
Step back.
But then in our very real day-to-day life, we forget that we are literally seconds away from death all of the time.
Yes.
You know, we talk about that in Buddhism, like, you know, it's like you die any second.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's this constant ongoing threat of nuclear
Yeah.
war. And
Especially now in North Korea.
yeah.
But it's not going to be on the scale that it would have been with the Russians.
Yeah.
if anything happens, and hopefully not.
I think that like complacency is another word that comes around we want to perhaps say acceptance, but then because that's actually it's the freedom from suffering is acceptance, and yet then that can become a complacency from bodhisattva perspective. It's like we may be personally more free from suffering, but there's
Yes.
other suffering because we're being too passive.
Yes.
So it's a fine line.
Since Trump's name was brought up, or maybe not, maybe it was the president, but this has been, for me, dealing with my outrage from the beginning of his campaign, of the way he would just make outrageous statements about other candidates that based on nothing, and stick to it and never apologize, even when the news shows that what he said wasn't true or was grossly exaggerated. I was just outraged, on top of outrage, on top, continually, and of course outraged when he won. Yeah. The people that elected, and then the sense of heaviness and darkness and tightness in my heart just oppressed me to the point where, well, that wasn't fair either. Outrage, being oppressed by this person. And then I realized that it was really influencing my mental health. And then I had to find a way to look at who this person really is and the people that support him and why they do. And I realized that it was because they're just all delusional in different ways. The supporters are deluded by thinking they're going to get something for nothing or stay in office or whatever. And he's just plain deluded about his ability to do anything about any of the problems or what his solutions are to deal with the problems that educated people don't think exist. And his solutions to other problems that do exist would make them worse. And so then instead of wanting to remove him from office, to put him in this place and show him how stupid he really is, because those thoughts went through my head too. I just can't wait until he gets his comeuppance, because he has to, right? This world isn't completely stupid, but these kinds of thoughts too, I just had to come to the place, well, where he may be reelected, he may not. It all depends on the will of the voters and whether there's enough of a backlash to him. And if he's removed from office, it won't be out of revenge or to put him in his place or anything else. It'll just be to make the world a safer place to be and to put him somewhere where he won't hurt the world or himself with compassion. And but I have to keep reminding myself of trying to look at it that way, because then some other surprise will come up and I'll get outraged all over again. So this is probably a pretty common experience for other people. So I think when I think of the verses for training the mind, and the person who, well, I don't know which verse it is actually, because it's not someone he placed hopes in, just a stranger. But but he is a teacher because he's shown me sides of myself that I didn't know existed, and helped me have more compassion for all the other people that are being immigrants and so forth, and all the other people that are being frightened and worried and damaged by his speech and his actions. It's very sad. But I can't. He's a broken person, and it's not his fault. He just got that way. He just all his life evolved that way, evolved into the person he is because of our broken worldly culture that's lived with us. So anyway.
From a Dharma perspective, I think another key thing is just around the view of the separate self and taking things personally. So in these examples of, this is I think a kind of an ideal perspective here. It's like we're working towards really seeing through the illusion of the separate self, which doesn't negate the dependently arisen person on our uniqueness as individuals, but that this core identity of I am this body and mind, and everything is as a kind of threat to me, and all that can be said about that kind of core teaching of the Buddha. And I think of these people like, I mean, I don't know for sure, but the examples like Rosa Parks or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, that I imagine that maybe it wasn't such a personal thing. They weren't taking it personally. So in that way, I usually think of the word anger, and the precept around anger, I think is about this type of, defending me as a person, and even maybe it's too much to go so far as to say when some injustice comes to me as a person, the response could be not that was unjust to me, but because it's to my race or to my gender or to the group that I'm part of. There can be a response, but almost like maybe it's too idealistic. But with those great leaders, maybe they actually did see it that way. It's like, this isn't even about me at all. But it is about my people, and something has to be done. And I think that's where the pivot of what I usually think of as anger is I have thought about it as always based on this. There's some sense of a separate me that's wrong, and so maybe righteous anger could be no sense of self at all. We've touched on this already in the discussion. And I think it's really hard to tell in ourselves where that is, because I think it's often mixed. We do feel a righteous sense of justice, but then there's also this personal thing in there. If we could separate them, that would be a great practice. Hard to tease them apart.
She mentions the anger that one feels as a mother. When you were talking about maybe being idealistic. I don't think it is. I think that people who have spent their life trying to be a leader in this compassionate way are acting out of a sense of wanting to protect and to save. It is, I mean, I am not Gandhi or Martin Luther King or any of those people, and I can't even aspire to be, because it's just like so far beyond what I feel like I am capable of in my everyday life. So I think for the average person in our practice, just that basic step of like, okay, is this anger about me? Is this anger about my ego? Or is this anger, holy anger? I think that's a really healthy question to ask yourself all the time. But the first step is to allow yourself to feel the anger
Yeah.
and to not
If it's
try to
there.
purge it. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. And so I just, it's why I brought this article, because I do think that maybe Zen especially can be a little bit subject to tempering emotion, and that emotion isn't a bad thing. I don't think that, I think our Dharma can be so in here sometimes, and that's just my own inclination too, is I can be very cerebral and not, when I'm reading something in particular, and not, it's very hard to relate that then to, and also, I mean, a lot of this was written thousands of years, or at least spoken, passed down for thousands of years, so it's hard to relate into our everyday life. But anyway, I think that there's a place for emotion, for strong emotion, and for even something as scary as anger in our practice.
And I think you're right that even if we have this ideal of selflessness, that we don't want to be spiritual bypassive. Well, if there is a self-centered, strong emotion, then let's not pretend that it's not
there.
and actually experience it. And that's the way that's the first step in actually being free from it.
Right.
The view of the self. Yeah.
Yeah, I really think that spiritual bypass is a risk in any spiritual practice, but maybe particularly so in Zen, because we do this sort of quiet sitting. So I know one thing that I've done a few times, did it recently actually, I had a feeling like I noticed I was being judgmental in an arrogant kind of way that doesn't fit with the precepts. So, but instead of trying to pretend that I wasn't feeling that way, which I think is what the spiritual bypass thing is, like push that down and just pretend and go, hello. And pretend you're not actually thinking, I don't like what you're doing. Instead, I just kind of admitted it to my teacher. And that way it kind of like, just put it out there. And then it can dissolve, then that's how it can dissolve. And I think that's a really good way to avoid the spiritual, to not get caught in sort of just trying to stuff things down.
Yeah.
Because it's not right. Instead, to just find someone to say, I notice I'm doing this and I don't feel good about myself that I'm doing this. Just find someone you trust to say that to, and that I think often just by just doing that can really alleviate it and go.
And the irony, kind of paradox there is that if we're really not identifying strongly with the separate self, we have no problem confessing the things because it's like, whatever, it's not me anyway, really.
It's a human condition.
But if we're really holding on to it, it's like, no,
Can't let anyone in.
yeah,
Can't admit.
yeah, it's kind of funny.
Give John a chance. John, are you there? John? You're on mute. If you wanted to give you a chance to say something if you wanted to.
Thank you.
Go for it. We can hear you.
I've just enjoyed the discussion, and I'm very appreciative that you included me tonight.
Well, thanks for joining, and good wishes to your mother.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, next month, anyone want to bring up a topic?
I guess it's me, right? I'll bring something. I don't know what I'm going to bring.
Okay. Yeah.
I can think about it. For a
And you
while.
know how, if you'd like to send something ahead to the group, you can for reading ahead, or
Sure.
you can just surprise
Close the
us.
topic. I'm not really sure what yet.
Yeah.
I was thinking it was going to be me. I didn't come up with the topic. I was hoping someone else would be
no,
here.
no rush.
But Yeah, I'll bring another topic and I'll email the group.
I think I'm gonna be gone next month during this time.
All right.
Sorry to miss you.
I'll still assign the reading though.
I'll still read it. I'll read it and send you an email separately.
All right.
March
We can
15th.
copy so we can hear what you have to say.
There's always the remote option as well.
Well, thank you. It's a great topic.
Yes.
Very fruitful.
Yeah, I think these, and it's kind of building on last month's discussion. Almost we could
Conversation.
keep going. Yeah.
Yeah.
About, emotions and practice. I could have a year of discussion.
That's a biggie.
Dedicate the merit of our gathering to the freedom and happiness of all beings. So anyway, John is
Right, John.
he's
See you next time.
taking care of his mother kind of full time. He's months now near the end of her life, but